Making a sequel to a hugely successful game is no easy feat. On one hand, you need to up the ante on the experience while staying faithful to the previous entry. It's finding the fine line between more of the same and making it different enough to not feel repetitive, a feat in which Halo 2 succeeded in gracefully, visually and through gameplay, of course building upon its narrative at the same time. It begins a short while after the events of the first one. We are introduced to a Covenant elite commander during a trial for his failure to protect the ring from destruction. The Prophets decide to strip him of his rank and torture him in front of a crowd as they believe his actions were heresy. We then jump over to the Chief, who's been equipped with shining new Mark 6 armour. After a brief shield test, Sergeant Johnson arrives to escort him to an awards ceremony held by Lord Hood. We are also introduced to Miranda Keyes, the daughter of Captain Keyes. The ceremony is cut short when a Covenant fleet arrives just outside of the range of the orbital defence grid. Hood is suspicious as the fleet that destroyed Reach was of far superior size. After kitting up and fighting off waves of enemies, it's revealed the station has been rigged with a bomb as two other stations have been witnessed exploding from the inside. The Chief is sent to deactivate the bomb before it's too late. With literally seconds remaining, Chief and Cortana disarm the bomb, and the Chief drags out the station to destroy Covenant cruiser single-handed. After landing feet first onto a UNSC in amber clad, they crash land into the African city of New Mombasa. The Chief is tasked with boarding the Covenant cruiser stationed over the city to interrogate the Prophet of Regret, one of the Covenant leaders. After a destructive battle, the fleet enters slipspace before he can get on board. With moments to spare, he boards a frigate and they follow them through the slipspace rupture. We then cut back to the disgraced elite commander to see him at the mercy of the other two prophets, Truth and Mercy. Instead of having him executed, they decide to make him become an arbiter and send him on a suicide mission, as all previous arbiters died fulfilling their duty. They test him with hunting down a so-called heretic, as he has convinced several other elites firing the rings are a doomsday scenario. It's at this point we assume control of the arbiter, and so begins the dual narrative of the game. After making his way through the facility the heretic is hiding in, the Flood have also infested the facility. The heretic tries to convince the arbiter to listen to him as he knows he is right. He even reintroduces the Oracle of Installation 04, as we know him, 343 Guilty Spark, to try and explain the truth. The arbiter then kills him and his squad leader Tartarus also captures the Oracle. He then returns to the Prophets for his next mission. We then jump back to the Chief and his team as they arrive on the other side of the slipspace jump. They are surprised to see that there is a second Halo. The Chief takes a team of ODSTs and lands on the ring, again with the mission to find the Prophet. After making his way through the terrain and having Cortana find out more about his intent, the other two Prophets want him dead as they see his premature invasion of Earth as a colossal failure. The Chief then finds his way to the Prophet after discovering he is planning on firing the rings, and then kills the Prophet just as a Covenant fleet arrives. Barely making it out, he lands in the middle of a lake to be grabbed by a tentacle who will be revealed later. We then jump back over to the Arbiter's side of the story, and he has been tasked with retrieving a sacred icon that will be the key for activating the ring. After encountering the Flood yet again, he arrives at the sacred icon and crosses paths with Johnson of all people. After a brief fight, he subdues him and retrieves the icon, only to discover Tartarus was tasked with killing him personally and that the Prophets ordered him to do it. The Chief comes to being dragged by the tentacle that caught him earlier, where he is then interrogated alongside the Arbiter by a creature that calls himself the Gravemind, a larger form of the Flood. He explains that the rings are not to be used as everyone will die. The Chief obviously agrees as he already knows this, but the Arbiter is determined to fulfill the great journey. The Gravemind sends them off to two different places in search of the key. The Chief is sent to the Covenant Holy City, High Charity, where the two Prophets are and who have the index. He then makes his way through the city, saving various Marines, and in Amberclad arrives through slipspace but cannot be contacted. He later learns that Miranda and Johnson are being escorted by Tartarus and that the ship was in fact being controlled by the Flood. We jump back over to the Arbiter, who has been teleported to just outside the control room. An injured elite explains that the brutes betrayed them and they are being hunted down. After making his way down to near the entrance, he is confronted by a tank which turns out to be a friendly. He states the Prophets are dead because of the brutes. It flashes back to Chief as he just missed the carriers containing the index, Johnson and Miranda. The Flood are quickly spreading through High Charity, and the Chief must make his way into the centre of the city as it is a Forerunner ship. Barely landing inside, it takes off, headed for Earth, but Cortana stays behind. In the final stretch, the Arbiter states he must get into the control room before it's too late, as the Gravemind was right all along. After fighting his way through various structures, he teams up with Johnson and they form an alliance, as it's within both their interests to not have everyone die. Johnson blasts the doors open and the Arbiter confronts Tartarus, explaining what the Great Journey really is. Refusing to accept it, he activates the launch sequence. After a violent fight, Tartarus is killed and the sequence is deactivated. Guilty Spark explains other installations are on standby to be fired from a place called the Ark, and the Arbiter then asks where it is. In the final scene, we see Chief arrive back at Earth in the Forerunner ship before he can be shot out of orbit as they think it's hostile. He states that it's him and he's finishing the fight. Well, honestly don't know where to even begin with this one. There's so much to discuss. I guess I should give a little background for those who aren't aware. Halo 2 had a notoriously troubled production. I guess over-ambition was the real culprit. Bungie spent over 2 years working on the game to reveal it at E3. However, after the demo they released, it simply wouldn't run on current software. They had done too much. So rather than fix the issues they had, they decided it was easier to just scrap it and start again. The whole game had to be finished in 9 months, and that explains why it seemingly ends so abruptly with a cliffhanger, which obviously annoyed many of the players at the time. With that out of the way, let's be more positive. Obviously, the only way to go was to be bigger and better than before, and despite all adversity, they pulled it off. Honestly, couldn't find anything that narratively doesn't add up. Everything is well written and means something to the story, small or not. The dual narrative is a real strong point. Introducing the Arbiter as a playable character was a brilliant move, and he's arguably just as good as the Chief. He was an adversary to him and is just as important to the story as the Chief. Obviously, a lot of people didn't like this inclusion because he wasn't advertised or seen in any promotional material, but that was by design. It was a twist. It was also brilliant how the Covenant got more depth within the game as you get to learn more about them. As in the first one, they were mysterious and you literally learned nothing about them. It's really interesting to see their hierarchy and politics, and it makes them feel more like an actual living, breathing faction and not just cannon fodder. Obviously, along with narrative depth, the gameplay featured many enhancements. It was the first one to include skulls to modify the game, basically cheat codes to make the game easier or more difficult depending on which ones you use. It also added dual wielding with any single-handed weapon. It encourages experimentation as there are so many different combinations to try and see what fits your playstyle. As well as visual and technical improvements, I'd like to discuss the soundtrack. Hands down had the best closing credits theme out of any of the games. What makes it even more awesome is they managed to get Steve Vai and John Mayer to play within the game's credits, and even Breaking Benjamin had a feature within the soundtrack. It was also the second to receive an anniversary edition, and honestly can't fault it. The Blur pre-rendered cutscenes are absolutely gorgeous and the gameplay itself looks just as incredible. Obviously it wasn't just a single player experience, the multiplayer is absolutely brilliant. It was the first one to really encourage party play and custom games. It introduced a lot more game types for a more diverse experience, along with entirely new maps as well as remakes as some fan favourites from Combat Evolved. And for me it has some of the best maps within the entire series. But its strength is also its flaw, I guess. Because of the troubled production, the game's engine was obviously full of exploits. Button combos kind of ruin the experience. You always seem to get some complete noob who's obviously spent way too long learning every one of them, who just owns you every time, and it's absolutely infuriating. And the sword launchers are just so overpowered with how far you can fly with them, it's absolutely insane. But jumping back to the single player, it's obviously got its flaws as well. The narrative consistency is perfect as I said, but gameplay wise, Oracle just feels so bloated. I don't know why it had to be so long. The lift section just drags every time and there's no real way to speed it up. There's the same problem with the gondola ride on the level Regret, aside from the gondolas being completely illogical, and that's not even start on legendary difficulty. So how do I sum this one all up? Obviously the pressure was on for Bungie to make an enjoyable game and get it out on time. The hype was unprecedented and even broke records at the time. When I look back on the game and the disastrous production, I can't help but smile. It easily stands as my favourite in the franchise. It built upon everything the first one did well and even excelled despite all odds. And this one was the one that definitely earned the series its place as a franchise worth getting excited about. Well, I think that about covers it. Signing off.